Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today for what I think will be a really informative webinar on siting energy storage projects in Massachusetts. My name is Andrew Kaplan. I am an energy regulatory attorney at Pierce Atwood, where I focus on energy storage projects. Joining me on the panel today is Dan Bailey, a Pierce Atwood land use attorney, and Rick Novak, a real estate attorney, who will take you through the necessary steps for success in siting storage facilities. Also joining us are Paul Rogers and Nick Petrakis. Paul is a retired lieutenant in the New York Fire Department, a specialist in battery safety, and the founder of the Energy Safety Response Group. Nick is also a retired New York firefighter and was the deputy director of FDNY's Tech Management Sustainability Group and had final FDNY approval for all BESS projects. So we have a really informative and experts on our panel today, and we're looking forward to today's program. Before we start the program, a couple of housekeeping things. First, we note that your questions will be in the Q&A section. So we'd ask that you, if you do have questions to any of the panelists, that you add those into the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to them at the end of the program. Second, once the presentation is complete, you'll be asked to work on a survey about today's presentation, and we appreciate you doing that. So let's get started with the first slide, please. When I started working with the energy storage industry, there were 75 megawatts of energy storage in a queue for the entire United States. And having worked hard to get the federal and state rules changed to allow storage on the grid to be paid for the value the resources provide, there are now ample opportunities to construct and operate battery storage facilities in Massachusetts and beyond. The good news for all of you is that storage procurement is both necessary for state governments to meet their climate change policy, and as such, there are goals established for adding storage to the grid. In Massachusetts, we have a goal that was set about 5 years ago, seeking 1,000 megawatt hours of energy storage to be operational by December 31st, 2025. The projects that this team alone has worked on will ensure that that goal is exceeded. Massachusetts also has a clean energy and climate plan in place where storage capacity will need to exceed 5.8 gigawatts of storage if we are going to see a 93% reduction in power sector emissions by 2050 compared to 1990 levels. Next slide, please. This slide is included in the climate plan, and it delineates what capacity benchmarks must be met for storage, offshore wind, onshore wind, and solar to ensure that we're going to meet the 2050 goals. So I've included that just so you can all focus on that once the program is complete. Next slide, please. I can tell you that to meet our goals in Massachusetts, we're going to need to clarify the regulatory path. And Governor Healy has wisely tasked Rebecca Tepper, who's the Secretary of Energy and Environmental Affairs, to figure all of this out. Right now, the regulatory path to successful siting includes many stops along the way. And Dan and Rick and Paul and Nick and I have recently had 2 projects that have gone through the steps and continue to do so. Dan and Rick will take you through the local process to see if a town will work with you to zone your project. But as you know, energy projects in general and battery projects specifically and recently do get pushback from some citizens. Some citizens will work with you to resolve their reasonable concerns, but we also hear from people who do not want a project built near their property, which are often called the NIMBYs, not in my backyard, or do not want a project built anywhere in their town, often called bananas, or build absolutely nothing anywhere near anything. So when dealing with a reasonable town government who were restricted for working with you by their NIMBY or banana residents, you have options. The Commonwealth does have the ability to authorize a zoning exemption from some or all of the town zoning restrictions to build projects that the DPU deems to be in the public interest. That's a path forward immediately that we'd be happy to help you navigate, and that is the path that several of our clients have successfully navigated or are currently contemplating. There are some government initiatives that might help clear the path for an expeditious or at least a successful permitting process. The governor has established a commission on energy infrastructure siting and permitting. I've been asked to participate on a siting practitioner advisory committee to help the commission formulate permitting rules and give sort of a reality check as to whether these changes that they're contemplating would likely have the desired impact of streamlining the permitting process. And the governor has requested that the commission provide her with recommendations by March. Another path that's under consideration is through the legislative process. There's legislation out there on both the House and the Senate side that would need to be tweaked to benefit storage providers, but at least just so you're aware, they're under consideration. We'd be happy to talk to you about those as well. Right now, they're just on hold. Finally, the DPU and the EFSB have some open dockets where they're evaluating how to enhance public awareness and participation in regulatory proceedings before those agencies. The DPU held a technical conference and the EFSB held a roundtable on these issues in August, and they are right now contemplating next steps in the process. As of today, there's really no ability for storage developers to seek approval by the Energy Facility Siting Board. And since there's no master override of local bylaws and only an opportunity for exemption from the zoning bylaws, Dan is going to discuss the parade of horrors that await you in towns that are proposing best facilities.
Sorry, I was muted. Thanks, Andrew. Again, I'm Dan Bailey. I'm going to talk about permitting, themes, tricks, and traps. My background is I'm not an energy lawyer. I'm a real estate development lawyer, and my history is doing all sorts of real estate development, from college facilities to hospitals to multifamily to planned master developments. But having joined Pierce Atwood 8 years ago, I was pleasantly surprised to learn that there were lots of energy facilities that needed permits as well, and that the same sort of challenges that we had with, in particular, cell towers back in the 90s awaited a lot of these energy facilities. So if I go to the next slide, please. So this is a less than completely artful example of the types of things that we think about when we're trying to do an battery storage facility. You'll see there a substation and a location known to me, but hopefully not known to anybody else in Massachusetts. There are also transmission lines right there. This is in the Boston suburbs. So this is a real site. Things to keep in mind, because we will talk about these as we go through this. There, of course, is a single family residence directly across the street. There's a school 4/10 of a mile. And the north arrow would be going up on this slide. There's a school 4/10 of a mile to the east. Access to the substation is through, it's hard to see it. The arrow didn't come out, but on the left, you can see exclusive access easement in orange. There's supposed to be an arrow going down to a very narrow gap between the trees, but that is an exclusive access easement to get into, for the power company to get into that substation. The proposed BESS site, which we've set up as a lease site, is immediately to the right in yellow. The lessor property is in red, so the lessee property is just a piece of the lessor property. Rick will probably in particular have fun with that. What's shown in green are what are known in Massachusetts as bordering vegetated wetlands. Those are jurisdictional wetlands where and we'll talk about this in a few minutes, but any work within those wetlands or within 100 feet of those wetlands requires a permit from the local conservation commission. And finally, just to have even more fun, the cross-hatched area in yellow is mapped endangered threatened species habitat under the Massachusetts Endangered Species Act. And no, we did not pick this just because it has lots of issues. Andrew, Rick, and I have worked on one site in particular that has all of these and then some. So it's pretty hard to avoid wetlands in Massachusetts on just about any remaining unbuilt property. It does happen, but it's rare. Endangered threatened species habitat is more extensive than you would think, because the list of those species is very long. The other thing that's important here is shown in blue, is it's shown as Massachusetts state route. We call it XYZ, but that means it's a Massachusetts state highway, which means that anything you do going in or out of that state highway requires approval by the Massachusetts Department of Transportation. So next slide, please. So, to steal from Tip O'Neill, land use is like politics. The policy is set at the federal and state level, but success is heavily dependent on what happens at the local level. Massachusetts has 351 cities and towns. We are a home rule state, which means that each city and town can make its own rules, subject to only certain limitations under state law. Next slide, please. So let's start with the easy part, generally, and that's federal permits. There usually aren't any, or they are easy to get. What are the federal permits that we typically think about in Massachusetts? Federal Clean Water Act, Section 404 permit for filling wetlands. As long as you stay under 5,000 square feet of wetland fill in Massachusetts, which almost no conservation commission is going to approve in the first place, you do not need any individual action from the Army Corps of Engineers. The Clean Air Act. As far as I've seen, the battery storage facilities don't produce emissions that would require any sort of permit under the Clean Air Act. Andrew's nodding his head, yes. FAA, Federal Aeronautics. Surprisingly, this does come up more frequently than you would think, because any work within 20,000 feet, linear feet of an airport, you have to think about. And, there's it's basically a triangle where the hypotenuse is running from the airport to the project site. And I think it's 1 foot in elevation for every 1,000 feet or every 100 feet. I can't remember exactly what. But the way that this gets implicated is not battery storage facilities themselves, but sometimes if you need tall cranes during construction, you might need to get FAA sign off. Again, not usually a difficult thing to get. Finally, the one thing that you do want to stay away from, first slide, first typo, under the Federal Endangered Species Act, long-eared, not long-tailed, the northern long-eared bat is an endangered species everywhere. We have them in Massachusetts. This is the type of thing that a permitting consultant will typically pick up on. And when we get that, as the lawyers, usually the entree for the land use lawyers is the first thing we get is a chart or a report from a permitting consultant that has evaluated the area for things like wetlands, endangered species, etc. And I haven't seen anything come across my desk yet within long-eared bat habitat, because I suspect the minute that the consultants see that, they tell the client that that's just not a viable location. So the next one, state permits. We'll start with the Massachusetts Environmental Policy Act, which is very similar to the federal NEPA statute. It requires environmental notification form for any projects that trigger MEPA. MEPA is administered by called the MEPA unit, but it's within the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs. There are two things that have to happen in order for there to be MEPA jurisdiction. The first is that there has to be some sort of state action. That's typically a state permit or approval, and that includes Energy Facility Siting Board orders, Department of Public Utilities orders, or any state permit. There are also some financing triggers, but I haven't seen any of them come up in energy projects. So if you have state action, and then you have project impacts that exceed certain permitting thresholds. And the ones, well, we used to think that battery would trigger 25 megawatts or more of electrical generation, but as a result of a couple of cases that Andrew was mentioning earlier in the EFSB decision in those cases, BESS is battery storage is not generation, at least under current law in Massachusetts. Also 25 acres or more of land alteration. That means just 25 acres of clearing. More than 5 acres of impervious surface, or wetlands filling of 5,000 square feet or more. There are other impacts, but battery storage facilities would be unlikely to trigger any of those impacts. And just a word about how MEPA works. The project proponent files what is known as an environmental notification form with the Secretary of Environmental Affairs. That environmental notification form is, I don't know, 20, 25 pages long, relatively straightforward to fill out. It's just facts about the project. It goes into the Secretary. State agencies and the public then have the opportunity to submit comments. Those ENS are published twice a month in what's known as the Environmental Monitor. There's a 30-day comment period, and the Secretary takes those comments and then makes a decision about whether the project impacts are sufficient enough that an environmental impact report is required. And if an environmental impact report is required, that will require the proponent to go into significant depth and analysis on all possible impacts from the project. Once the environmental impact report is done, that again goes to the Secretary. There's another public comment period. And if all goes well, the Secretary determines that the project proponent has made sufficient mitigation to prevent undue harm to the environment, and issues a Secretary certificate saying that the project complies with MEPA. For an ENF, the process is very quick, 40, 45 days. An ENR, an EIR, the process of review is also quite quick. Once you've submitted it, usually gets done in 60 to 70 days. But it's the timing is the amount of time that it takes you to put together the EIR, and that can take several months. Next slide, please. Other state permits and approvals. Andrew has already touched on this, and this is a critical one, so I'll spend a little bit of time on it. It's the Department of Public Utilities zoning exemption. The Department of Public Utilities can grant a comprehensive, it can grant an individual exemption for, say, height, but it also can grant a comprehensive exemption which overrides all local zoning requirements. We'll get into that in a little bit more depth when we talk about zoning and why you might want to seek a zoning exemption. There's also the Wetlands Protection Act, which covers a permit is required for any work within 100 feet of a wetland resource area or 200 feet of a river. The Wetlands Protection Act is administered in the first instance at the local level by the Municipal Conservation Commission, which is a group of 7 volunteers who may or may not be qualified to be evaluating things like wetlands impacts. Sometimes they're political, sometimes they're not. A tough board to get through on a controversial project. Then the other state permit that, and this goes back to the visual picture I showed a little while ago, is a Massachusetts Department of Transportation highway access permit. If you're opening up a new curb cut on a state highway, this is a permit that you need. And this is one of the ones that frequently you don't hit any of the MEPA thresholds. And, the client's real happy. Well, I don't have any wetlands impacts. I don't need any of these other state permits. And you say, well, wait a minute, you're on state route XYZ and you need a driveway. You need a state permit. And okay, now you're in MEPA. So the next slide, please. The Natural Heritage and Endangered Species Program, that was the yellow cross hatching, and that applies for any work in priority habitat for threatened endangered species. For the most part, this doesn't have, I guess the best way I'd put it is, doesn't have a lot of teeth in it. It's relatively straightforward to work with, except for certain endangered species, or if you're altering more than 2 acres. The quick story I can tell about endangered species, and it hasn't come up on an energy project, but one time we were out in the western part of the state, we were doing a couple of hockey rinks for a private school, and the environmental notification form was submitted, and we got a letter from the endangered species program saying, wait a minute, you haven't evaluated the impact on rattlesnakes, and this is eastern timber rattlesnake habitat. That's when I got a call. And I said, I don't know anything about rattlesnakes, but lo and behold, I know someone who does. So we brought in a very well-known herpetologist who assisted the school in, a little bit of redesign to remove those rinks from snake habitat. And let's see, the other one, Mass Historic Commission. If you have a project that requires a state permit, you'll have to touch base with Mass Historic and get a determination of no significant impact. Again, on these types of sites, which tend to be vacant sites, often in less populated parts of the state, you're more likely to run across some sort of mapped archaeological space that the state will want you to evaluate, just to make sure there are no you're not going to dig up anything that has archaeological value. Next slide, please. Municipal permits. Okay, zoning. This being Massachusetts, almost nothing of any size or any impact can walk in with the building permit plans and get a building permit. It's not at all unusual for something as small as 4 or 5 parking spaces to require what's known as site plan approval. So there are 3 types of zoning approvals that we typically see in Massachusetts: special permits, site plan approval, and variances. Special permits, also known as conditional use permits in a lot of other jurisdictions, those are discretionary, typically issued by the town municipal planning board. They require a supermajority vote. So if you have a 5-member planning board, you need 4 votes in order to issue that permit. They require public hearings. All abutters are notified, and they can be a circus, I guess is the best way to put it. You bring in your experts. If there are opponents, they bring in their experts, and those hearings can go on for months and months. Another type of approval that is frequently required is site plan approval. Now, site plan approval means the use is allowed by right, but that the planning board or the site plan approval authority has the right to impose reasonable conditions. What are reasonable conditions? Screening, limitations, noise mitigation, access, making sure that the access point is safe, stormwater controls. What are unreasonable conditions? A condition that might require noise mitigation beyond any state or local rule or bylaw. A condition that would reduce the size of the project to make it uneconomic. A condition that would require a new traffic light just because it's a good place. Somebody thinks it's a good place for a new traffic light. And the last thing are variances. Use variances are a very rare thing in Massachusetts. Most communities don't allow them, but dimensional variances are not at all unusual. Where we run across the variance issue on energy projects is maybe not so much, a setback or a height or something like that, but a lot of zoning bylaws have lot coverage requirements. So you can't cover more than, say, 50% of the lot. You've got to have 50% open space. and you may not have that. So special permits and variances are both can be appealed by any abutter within 20 days after the decision is issued. It can tie you up in court for some considerable amount of time, though. You're going to win a variance case because, well, no, you're going to lose a variance case. Variances are frowned upon because the legal standard for them is so high that they are very rarely upheld on appeal. I encourage clients, energy clients, to seek a zoning exemption because the local process is so cumbersome, time-consuming, and subject to appeal. Site plan approval, which on its face seems like a pretty, okay, I can live with those conditions. What's the big deal? I can go get the site plan approval. But the risk on site plan approval is that, unlike special permits and variances, a site plan approval isn't the appeal period starts from the issuance of a building permit. So theoretically, you could have a site plan approval. You could go through, get all of your design, engineering, bidding, construction done, go in, get your building permit, and somebody appeals it and takes your site plan approval into court. Now, you could go forward at risk, but lenders don't like that, to be blunt, and it creates quite a problem. So next slide, please. Other municipal permits that you need to think about are many cities and towns in Massachusetts have a local wetlands bylaw that is adopted under local law. It's not the same as the state law. Usually they have broader rules, and you're under a state wetlands bylaw appeal, your appeal goes to the Department of Environmental Protection, where 9 times out of 10 the DEP is going to side with the landowner. A local wetlands bylaw has to be appealed to Superior Court, and the appeal is limited to the record before the Concom. Those are very difficult cases to win. You need a fire chief permit for energy storage. You may need a separate stormwater discharge permit. You may need an earth removal permit, and if you're doing a new cut on any town road, you'll need a curb cut permit. Why are these troublesome, particularly the local wetlands bylaw? I'll focus on that one. The local wetlands bylaws, as I said, they're ubiquitous, and there is no state override. Unlike with zoning, you cannot go where you can go to DPU and get an exemption. There's, under current law, there is no override, exemption, or anything else over a local to reverse a local wetlands bylaw, other than trying to go to court and get it reversed that way. Next slide, please. That might be it. Yes, that is it. I don't think I'm too far off time.
Thank you so much, Dan. And now we will ask Paul and Nick to chime in.
Great. Thanks, Andrew. Thanks, Dan. That was really good. So the next challenge that you may see is energy storage safety. So just a little bit about our company and about my background and Nick's background. We both part of the New York City Fire Department when these things started to show its faces in New York City back in 2013. And we looked at the codes and standards, and they really weren't right in order to cover the hazards that were part of the energy storage systems. So we started to look at these energy storage systems, and we started to put prescriptive codes together for New York City installations. A lot of that stuff was used to on the national side through the NFPA, which I'll get into in a little bit. You can go to the next slide. And we're going to start to see these energy storage systems all over the place, indoors, outdoors, mobile systems, and more to come. We were just working on something recently down in Utah, Salt Lake City, for the NFPA codes on energy storage systems that are going to be on barges. But there's going to be numerous different locations, and there are going to be numerous challenges in order to get these things in there and making sure that we have the proper safeties that are connected with them. And it's technically the information that we see in the codes that are currently out there are very technical. And as Dan mentioned before, we need to get a fire permit. And one of the things that the fire departments are looking at is they don't understand the codes. So trying to make that connection so they understand the technical part and actually go into layperson's terms that they understand that is really important. And that's what ESRG does. We are retired from the fire service. We get it. We understand it. Our main goal is looking out for the safety of the fire service. And when we developed our code in New York City, we had that in mind, is to make sure that the fire service was taken care of. And there was a balance, right? We knew that we needed safety, but we also wanted to make sure that we protected the people that may go to these things in the event that they failed. You can go to the next slide, please. So this is just showing it's a different enclosure type. This is an example of where a lot of the fire chiefs will start to delve into the code and not fully understand it. And this big thing here where we're looking at outdoor installations, there is a big difference between what we see here on the screen within what they call a walking container. It's totally defined, and a cabinet. If you see, I've highlighted in red. This is similar to what we had in Surprise, Arizona. For those people who don't know, Surprise, Arizona is the one that really put energy storage safety on the map. It was an incident that took place. I have a slide on it down the road, but a couple of firefighters were hurt on that. And as a result of that, a lot more safety went in there that was relative to the fire service. You can go to the next slide, please. Keep going. So when we first looked at this, we weren't sure of the hazards that were involved with it. You know, one of the first questions that we had back in 2013 when people came into the New York City Fire Department in Brooklyn and our headquarters, we asked them what happens when these energy storage systems actually go on fire. And the quote was, they don't go on fire. Well, we had them do some testing, and sure enough, this is what we came out with. So all of these things need to be addressed, the primary hazards here, and this is exactly what's scaring a lot of the people in the permitting process. When you go out there, there's a lot of citizens that come in and they talk about these e-bikes or these micro-mobility scooters that are going on fire, and they try to put that industry into the energy storage system. Industry, and it's two separate industries, and you have to make that distinction. Otherwise, you're going to find yourself in a big with some big problems down the road. You can go to the next slide. So the primary hazards and the failures and why these things actually happen is thermal abuse, electrical abuse, mechanical abuse, some of these cell defects and components. Improper installation is another problem. We have seen a couple of installations that have failed as a result of the improper installations. So we have to make sure that everyone who is doing this work is getting qualified people to install these things properly. All the stuff that you see that's on there as far as the failure modes, all of that stuff is looked at on the codes and standards. As I mentioned before, it's very technical, but all of those things need to be addressed. And again, when you're going in to meet with the fire service, you need to explain to them how they are addressed through the codes, and understanding the technical part of how they're addressed is really, really important. You can go to the next slide, please. So just a little bit about the national codes, if you're not familiar with it. Massachusetts primarily uses NFPA 855. There are other ones. The International Fire Code is used by a lot of other states for those people who are doing work outside the Massachusetts industry. The state of Massachusetts. So there is they pretty much are aligned, these two particular codes and standards. So this is prescriptive codes or prescriptive measures that will give installers requirements on putting these energy storage systems in there. As I mentioned before, these are very, very technical, and if you don't understand it, you could screw it up. And you are probably going to have to go to the local AHJ to make sure that they understand it. We always recommend that you get in early and you start explaining how these codes works, how they were developed, and what's the meaning behind the codes. I currently sit on the NFPA 855 along with Nick Petrakis, who's on here. We just had a meeting last week down in Utah, looking to update and try to close some of the gaps that we're seeing. But these things here are what the fire service is really concerned about, making sure that you follow the rules and regulations inside these codes and standards. You can go to the next slide, please. So just a little bit about energy storage systems. As I mentioned before, people are always concerned about failures, and you see quite frequently in the news about lithium-ion batteries. So they equate these lithium-ion batteries that are going on fire in micro mobilities or e-bikes, they equate that to the lithium-ion batteries that are going on fire, that could possibly go on fire in the energy storage systems. And there is, as I mentioned before, there is a big difference. And this is just showing you the layers of safety that is involved with energy storage systems. This industry on energy storage has so many layers of safety that far outweigh any other industry. Even the electric vehicles, they outweigh them. They ask for a lot of different listings to make sure that you reduce the risk of a failure. The thing on the bottom there about large-scale fire testing, this is really, really important. It is a data collection test that manufacturers have to put their energy storage through. It is extremely expensive for them to do this type of testing. When we were first developing the code, not knowing how these things would perform during a failure, we started to ask for this large-scale fire testing. Basically, this is the linchpin of safety, saying, okay, you say that it's safe, now we want you to actually show us. Do some large-scale fire testing and make sure that we get the results. So it's a data collection test. And if you go to the next slide, it gets a little deeper into what this large-scale fire testing is. So the large-scale fire testing looks at every different level of the energy storage system, right down from the cell level. And then a group of cells will lead into the module level. There's testing that's done on there, and you can see the performance requirements on the right-hand side of that graph there. And then you get into what they call a rack or a unit level testing, and then finally an installation testing. So at every component, right down to the cellular level, this large-scale fire testing is collecting data, and that data is going to be used to give to the local AHJ. Local AHJs, and I've dealt with this on numerous occasions throughout the country and internationally, do not understand how this test works. And if you don't understand how this test works, they may bring in someone who doesn't understand it either as an advocate or a peer review person who actually will misinterpret how this test works. This is another standard that's out there. It's a UL, Underwriters Laboratory, large-scale fire testing. I sit on that standard also, looking out again for the fire service and making sure that they are represented in this testing here. You can go to the next one. So this is just basically showing you how one of these things to test. You can see this is a big container full of batteries. They purposely set it on fire, put it into failure, and they collect data from it. As I mentioned before, very, very expensive, but the data that comes out of it is what we need to show for safety. So the codes go down and they look at trying to prevent an incident from taking place. And then they even go further than that. They said, well, let's say all of these safeties that are out there do fail and we do get a fire. What is that fire going to look like? And this is all done in order to look at safety. So they look at it from trying to stop the fire, from trying to prevent the fire. And then if it does go on fire, the goal of this 9540A testing is to try to make sure it limits the spread of the fire within the actual container itself. You can go to the next slide. This comes up quite frequently in a lot of the AHJ meetings when you're going for permitting about explosion. And a lot of people are afraid to use this word, explosion here, but it is in the code. So I like to address it head on. But what we do is if there was an event that takes place, could there be an explosion? Possibly, but what we do is we try to reduce that risk as a result of preventing it by pulling it out by fans, or we have managing it, which is called deflagration venting. So these are two ways that the codes look at this and saying, all right, if there is a potential of an explosion, we want to make sure that we can manage it. So it's in the code. So we have to make sure that the AHJ is aware that we're going to manage this to make sure either it doesn't happen, or if it does happen, that no one's going to get hurt. And that comes into fire department training. You can go to the next slide. This is just showing you, I put this in here really just to show you how deep we get into codes and standards. Now, if you're just a regular AHJ, and some of these AHJs that are out there, great people, very nice people, they have to do a lot of work. When this comes in front of them, they have no idea what to do with this. So again, not only do you have to do what they call a failure modes and effects analysis, this is a hazardous mitigation analysis, but you also have to explain how it works. So you have to give a report on this. Some people will just give this raw material right here to the AHJ and say, good luck with that. And, they usually can't make heads or tail of it, which will slow down your permit process. It will slow that down because they don't understand it. So you have to, again, be in there to make sure that they have any requests or concerns or questions that you're able to go in there and explain it to them. You can go to the next slide, please. So again, I mentioned that we look at it from the lens of the fire department because usually the fire department shows up when everything failed. So we have to make sure that we address those concerns. The fire department definitely needs to have some training, and that training needs to be available for anyone that may show up in the event of a failure. You can go to the next slide, please. Hey, law of averages, things will fail. It happens. It's going to happen. There's a lot of them out there, but things fail. And this thing hasn't even been updated. But things do fail. And the nice part is we haven't seen any adverse effects from the fire service or even people that may be affected in their particular area. The one that I have highlighted is the one in Surprise, Arizona. We can go to the next slide. So this is what happened in Arizona. This incident that took place in 2019 was an event where they had a battery failure. There was a large gas that actually built up on the inside. The fire department opened the door, and then sure enough, about 3 minutes later, after opening the door, they had an explosion to take place. Now, a lot of people look at this and this comes up at so many meetings. You need to address this properly. How do you address it properly? This was built before the current codes and standards were available. The current codes and standards, this would not have happened or would have been significantly reduced from happening. But this probably would not have happened if the current codes were applied to this particular installation. You can go to the next slide. Just a heads up, if there is an incident that takes place, and we've seen a couple of that take place, there's a long duration for the fire service. So the fire service is always asking for an SME, subject matter expert, for some sort of support. We know that these things may have stranded energy that's still inside the batteries even after a failure. We know that sometimes they have a delayed ignition. So these are all things that the fire department is concerned about. So basically, they want to hand off this information. They want to hand this site off. So they're not putting a fire watch and depleting their fire coverage as a result of putting people on the scene. So this is a big thing that the fire department asked for. You should talk to the developers to make sure that they know that this is going to be something that they're going to have to address if they're going for their permit. You can go to the next slide. And just really, they asked for this special expert, but they don't have any qualifications. So New York City saw this as an issue. These energy storage systems will be unique and different, and each one of them have to have their own training session associated with them. But also, we wanted to make sure that someone is aware of what this energy storage system is about, all the different fire protections that are involved with it. And they would be the ones who are taking over the scene after the fire department leaves. So the fire department is not, staying there and putting resources there for a long amount of time. And a lot of these things are unstaffed. So New York City has this thing called a certificate of fitness, B28, which is basically a test for someone to take to make sure that they understand what energy storage system and how they're going to integrate into the incident command system in the event of a failure. I think that's the last slide. You can go to the next one. Okay, so this is, again, just showing you, if you see on the top right hand, we did a report on this one. That is a large-scale event that took place in Australia. I would tell you to do your due diligence and read that report. It really showed that the fire department did a really good job, and we learned a lot from that. But if you go into Victoria big battery fire incident, that report is online. Again, the ESRG had done that report, and there was a lot learned on it from the fire service, and that we use that sometimes to leverage safety, so they know that we are that we're looking out for them. You can go to the next slide. So there's a lot going on in this whole realm of fire safety. You should be aware that if you do go for permitting, a lot of these questions will come up. And that's it, Andrew. You can go to the next.
Thank you, Paul. As you know, the Mass DPU and EFSB spent a lot of time with you testifying on all of these issues. One thing I would ask you, though, before we go on, is what does AHJ stand for?
Yeah, thank you for that question. The authority having jurisdiction, so the ones who is actually going to be reviewing it from their discipline. In this case, it would be the fire department, would be the authority having jurisdiction, making sure that you're following the proper prescriptive codes dedicated to the fire service itself.
Okay, thank you very much to Paul and Nick, and Rick, you're up.
All right, great. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Rick Novak from Pierce Atwood. Like Dan, I've had a lot of roles over the years, but mostly I'm a recovering real estate development lawyer. Now almost all of my work is energy related: hydros, merchant fossil plants, terrestrial and offshore wind, and the support ports, solar, and of course storage. And the storage battles remind me a great deal of the cell tower wars from earlier in my career in the 1990s. Lots of fear mongering, lots of NIMBY. And now a cell tower is just a modern part of life. Nobody drives by them and worries about them, and everybody uses them. I'm hoping that someday we'll get there with storage, but today is not that day. Next slide. Okay, so first of all, everything that Dan mentioned in his presentation, most sites have many of those issues. I know it seemed like an awful lot of issues for one small site, but in our experience, that is a fairly typical suite of problems. Okay, from the pure real estate side, it starts easy, then it gets very difficult. For people from out of state, we have a subdivision control law. A buildable lot in Massachusetts in general has to have frontage on a public way. In Dan's example, there was frontage on the state highway, and the legal lot size is tied to local zoning. So if you do have to go through subdivision, there's a couple of ways to do it. One is the traditional definitive plan, which is very rare for solar or storage. And the other is a so-called ANR, the approval not required plan, sometimes called an 81P plan. But a major exception to Massachusetts subdivision that is often used for storage facilities, which are typically located back in the woods next to an existing substation, is a leased lot does not need subdivision approval. So you can put it right in the middle of a lot and not have to worry about subdivision access. But the trap there is that sometimes your local distribution company may want part of the connection owned in fee by them. And then if you are conveying a lot in fee to them, first of all, you have to negotiate that with your landowner. And second of all, you need to figure out a way around the subdivision problem. Often the solution is Massachusetts General Laws, Chapter 41, Section 81X, in which the lot you convey is not a separate building lot and becomes a building lot only when combined with the LDC's substation. Next slide, please. All right, another common trap is you say, well, I've got great access coming in here because there's an old road from when this was a cranberry bog or a farm or whatever. And it goes across the abutter who is your major opponent in your permitting process. Well, you may want to look at that easement carefully because maybe it allows you road access, but it may not allow easement for road access for your use. Or it may allow you road access only and not the underground electric and security facility infrastructure that you need to put in as well. So beware of sites that only have access by easement. Make sure the easement supports what you can actually do. Next slide, please. Okay, now the easy part is over. Unfortunately, because many sites for storage are backland or lands that have been not developed for a long time, they're often so-called Massachusetts chapter lands. And in Massachusetts, all of our properties are designed to be, or required by statute to be assessed at their full and fair market valuation. That sounds good, that sounds fair. But if you've got someone who's got a farm with 300 acres and the highest and best use of that farm is to convert it into a residential subdivision, he's going to have a very strong and perverse incentive to convert that into a residential development as opposed to keeping it a farm. The solution from the legislature 40 plus years ago was 3 statutes: Massachusetts General Laws, Chapter 61 for forest land, Chapter 61A for agricultural land, and 61B for recreational land. That allows those landowners to apply for a special lower tax assessment for forest land, agricultural land, and recreational land for the duration of the favored use. So it's good social policy. Now, why the legislature did not use one statute for all 3 is something you'd have to ask the legislature. Each was drafted differently. Each are similar. They have minor key differences, and the drafting is absolutely Byzantine. All of us who work with it know that you have to read the statute, every word, every time. Next slide, please. So, as I mentioned, many energy storage and other renewable development sites like solar are chapter lands here in Massachusetts. Many landowners and local assessment boards draw the special assessment lines on the back of an envelope in an informal conversation with the landowner, and nobody has any thought as to future access, development, or conveyance. So you'll have this box in the middle of a large parcel that's the specially assessed area, and it might reach over into your site in part or in whole, and then you have a problem. I underlined this next part, and I think I show it up several times in the slides because, and I'm sure Dan would agree with me, that erroneous chapter lands withdrawal tax are a common and major pitfall for out-of-region developers. Next slide, please. Why is it such a problem? Well, let's first talk about how you get out of chapter lands. The first is the easiest. You decide you don't want the tax break anymore. You don't renew the special assessment, and the land reverts back to regular assessment. What could be easier? Except true lapse is very uncommon, because if you had this great tax benefit, why would anybody ever give it up? They don't. The second is conversion of the land to another use. So, for example, let's say you've got a large parcel and it abuts, in Dan's example, a local distribution company switch station. You might want to convert that part of your parcel to an energy storage facility and hook up to the grid there. And that wouldn't be a sale, because it's just a lease of the site, and that is in fact our most common set of facts in this area. Now note that the landowner conduct objectively indicating an intent to convert, filing plans, development agreements, all sorts of things like that, may legally constitute a deemed conversion under Sudbury versus Scott, a 2003 case, which Dan will agree changed the game for everybody in chapter lands. So it can't be, what does not work is pretending that you're going to keep the land in agricultural use while quietly doing a side deal to convert it to a storage facility. And the final trigger for chapter lands exit is a sale to a third party for other use. Let's say you're just selling the whole thing outright, and someone's putting up a combined solar storage facility. That triggers things as well. Next slide, please. Okay. So remember that by signing up for chapter lands treatment, the landowner got a great benefit: years and years and years of significantly lower real estate taxes. Well, when you exit, you have to pay the piper. And there are 2 aspects of that. One, for solar and storage developers, is relatively minor. There's a recapture tax. It's a relatively small amount of money. And in the scale of the cost of developing a $100 million energy storage project, it's not that much. One of them recently we had, the recapture tax amount was $20,000. So not nothing, but not enough to sort of move the needle on your overall project development. But here at the bottom, this is the killer. Sale, conversion, or deemed conversion all trigger town purchase rights under each of the chapters. For sale, it's a matching right. And for conversion, which again is the most common, it's an appraised value purchase price. So for example, if you had a deemed conversion and you did not go to the town, but simply did all these things, you could be well along in your project, have gotten all your permits, be going for, say, financing or tax equity investment, and have someone from the town pop up and say, hi, 3 years ago, you entered into a deemed conversion of your land to storage development from agricultural use. And nobody came to us for a waiver of the town purchase rights, and we can buy the property out from underneath you at an appraised value. And if you dumped, $100 million into development, that will be a very disappointing conversation to have. Next slide, please. Okay, so just to emphasize the last point, failure to correctly terminate town purchase rights is fatal to your project. The outstanding rights are a real estate title defect. It renders your project title unmarketable. No responsible lender or tax credit investor will provide the funding. You just have to kill this off, and you have to kill it off cleanly. Some problems with that: the chapters were drafted by municipal lawyers to favor the towns, so terminating the town rights is difficult. Also, the statutes are very poorly drafted, which allows for lots of room for misinterpretation or creative interpretations. The town rights to purchase can be assigned to a nonprofit, which may have been purposely created and funded by your project opponents. It's very easily done. Also, many town council and project opponent councils are very adept at manipulating this chapter land's exit process to leave the town rights alive but in limbo, which is fatal to your project. Remember, you only win if the town rights are absolutely terminated. If the town rights are kinda, maybe, sorta still alive, that's all your project opponent needs, and that's often what they will be angling for, to just trip you up with a footfall and leave you in limbo. So again, erroneous chapter lands withdrawal tactics are a common pitfall for out of region developers. All right, let's quickly go over 3 tactics that don't work very well, but we see them all the time. Next slide. The first is quiet quitting. The developer and the landowner say, don't worry, we'll do this all in a wink. We won't have any documents. We'll just have had these informal conversations. Let the assessment lapse, wait a year, and then we'll do our deal. The problem is that under the Sudbury versus Scott case, quiet quitting is wholly unreliable. A project opponent can pop up later, argue that you had a deemed conversion and the town purchase rights are alive, and then you're dead, because when you go back to ask for the town's help, your opponents are already well organized, well funded, and really angry. Next slide, please. Also, it doesn't work, but we see it all the time. Don't worry, I had a friend in town hall. Look, here, I've got this document here. My friend, the town manager, signed it. That's nice, and it's often done in good faith, but it doesn't work. The statute sets forth a very specific process of notices, filings, and public actions required to issue a valid waiver of the town rights. If you miss any of those steps, the town rights are arguably alive. And if they're arguably alive, you have a problem. Next one. Okay, this is the final one we see all the time. Don't worry, this town will never raise the money. Well, the problem with that is the town doesn't have to raise the money. Someone else can raise the money. You can assign it to the town can assign the purchase rights to a nonprofit, and often that nonprofit was created yesterday by a deep-pocketed opponent of your project. So you can't count on the town not having the money. We're almost out of time. Next slide. What does work? Plan way ahead. This process can take 3 to 6 months or more to manage and navigate. Coordinate with the assessors and appraisers, and pick the right lawyers. Make sure your Chapter 61 counsel is in fact prepared and experienced in the intricacies and traps of these unusual statutes, and prepared to maneuver you through the thicket. 12:59, 1 minute left. I think that's my last slide. There we go. Andrew, you want to wrap us up?
I do. So excellent. Thank you very much. We do have a number of questions. We have about 30 seconds. I'll just start with the first one. Is the fire chief permit required in every locality, or is it a town by town dependent?
Every locality, it's a requirement of the state fire code.
Thank you very much. And I will say that most of the questions that came across are from an anonymous attendee. So we're not able to respond to you individually. If you would like to send your question to me, akaplan@pierceatwood.com. I am happy to forward it to the right person for response. And with that, I will say thank you very, very much to our panelists. I thought this was really informative, and we appreciate your time. Thank you very much.